The silence on Heron Lake had only just started to feel like peace again when the phone rang. It had been 3 weeks since we said goodbye to Eleanor, and every sunrise still felt like a question she wasn't there to answer. I was sitting on the porch of our cottage, holding one of her old spinning reels in my lap, feeling the familiar weight of it. It was a Penspin Fisher, solid steel and brass, a gift I'd bought her for our 20th anniversary. Now it felt alien in my hands, a relic from a life that belonged to someone else. Everything felt like that now. The worn wood of the porch railing under my palm, the scent of pine needles on the damp morning air, even my own reflection in the dark glass of the sliding door, a stooped, unfamiliar old man. You won't believe the level of betrayal that was about to unfold, so make sure you subscribe and follow along to see how this story ends. The phone buzzed again, insistent. I finally reached for it, my own voice sounding rusty when I answered. "Hello? Dad, it's Ethan." His voice had that clipped, efficient tone he used when he was closing a deal. There was no warmth, no preamble. "Good news. We've accepted an offer on the cottage." I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. The spinning reel suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and I let it slide from my lap where it landed on the wooden planks with a dull thud. For a moment, the only sound was the cry of a loon out on the water, a lonely, echoing sound that seemed to mock the chaos erupting in my chest. "An offer? What are you talking about, Ethan? The cottage isn't for sale." "Of course it is," he said, his voice laced with that familiar, weary impatience, the tone he used when explaining something obvious to a child. "We got a fantastic all-cash offer, 20% over asking. It's a developer from downstate. They're not even asking for an inspection. It's a clean getaway for you." A getaway. As if this place, this sacred piece of land where I had taught him how to bait a hook, where I'd held his sister Chloe's hand as she walked down to the makeshift altar on the lawn, was a prison. As if 50 years of memories could be scrubbed clean by a cashier's check. "You had no right," I managed to say, my voice tight. "Eleanor and I built this place with our own 2 hands. The deed is in my name. Dad, please don't be difficult," he sighed, and I could practically hear him pinching the bridge of his nose. "We're handling it. Chloe listed it quietly last week. We knew you'd be emotional, so we decided to just manage the process and bring you the good news once it was a sure thing. We're just trying to protect you, to streamline your assets. This place is a money pit. The dock needs replacing, the roof is 20 years old, it's a liability." A liability. I looked out at the dock, at the exact spot where Eleanor had sat just last summer, her bare feet dangling in the water, a book in her lap. I thought of the faint pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, tracking the heights of my children and then my granddaughter, Maya. Each line was a story, a moment frozen in time. To Ethan, it was just old wood and peeling paint. I wondered if he remembered any of it, or if his memory had been wiped clean and replaced with spreadsheets and commission rates. I thought of Eleanor, just before the end. She'd been looking out this very window at the lake, her hand in mine. "Be careful, Art," she'd whispered, her voice thin as a dragonfly's wing. "They love you, but they count things differently than we do." At the time, I'd thought she was just tired. Now her words felt like a prophecy. They weren't selling a house, they were closing out an account. My account. "I'll call you back," I said, my voice flat and distant. I hung up before he could object. I stood there on the porch for a long time, the Michigan air turning cold against my skin. The silence of the lake returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the vast, empty silence of betrayal. They thought they were managing my estate. They had no idea they had just declared war on a ghost. After I hung up on Ethan, I expected the phone to ring again immediately. It didn't. That was worse. The silence was a tactic, a space designed for me to fill with my own doubt. I sat there for an hour, watching the sun climb higher over the lake, the brilliant light doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. They weren't just taking my home, they were taking my history, editing my life story down to a single, final chapter titled Convenience. My convenience, they'd say, but it was theirs. I was a loose end, a sentimental asset that had stopped appreciating, and it was time to cash out. Ethan finally called back just before noon. This time his voice was stripped of all pretense. It was the voice of a manager addressing a difficult employee. "Dad, I've had a word with Chloe," he began. "We're in agreement. The offer is too good to pass up, especially in this volatile market. We have a fiduciary responsibility to make the right call here." Fiduciary responsibility. The words were so cold, so corporate. He spoke as if I were a line item in a portfolio he managed, a stock that had peaked and was now in decline. A responsibility to whom, Ethan? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. To your mother's memory or to your bank account? He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. Emotion doesn't pay property taxes, Dad. It doesn't fix a leaking roof or replace a rotting dock. I'm sending you the offer paperwork. Look it over. You'll see that our logic is sound. And then he was gone, leaving me in a silence that was now filled with the hum of his cold, irrefutable numbers. The real ambush came the next morning. Chloe's car, a pristine white SUV that looked out of place on our gravel driveway, pulled up just as I was finishing my coffee. She stepped out holding a bakery box and wearing an expression of deep theatrical concern. She was the velvet glove to Ethan's iron fist, and in many ways she was far more dangerous. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft and syrupy as she set the box on the kitchen table. "I brought you those cinnamon rolls you like from Miller's." She looked around the familiar kitchen, her eyes lingering on the water stain on the ceiling, the slight crack in the linoleum. But she wasn't seeing memories. She was building a case. I was so worried after Ethan called. He can be so blunt. I wanted to make sure you were okay. She sat across from me, her hands folded neatly on the table. "We just see you here, all alone, and our hearts break. Honestly, what if you fell? What if something happened? Who would even know for hours? We're not doing this to be cruel. We're doing it because we love you. We're trying to get you closer to us, to family." As she spoke, she slid a glossy brochure across the table. The cover showed a group of smiling, silver-haired strangers playing shuffleboard under a perfectly blue sky. The title read, "Golden Horizons, A New Beginning." I opened it. The pictures inside were of sterile, beige apartments. There were lists of amenities, weekly bingo nights, water aerobics, a shuttle to the mall. It was a blueprint for a life where every edge had been sanded down, every risk eliminated, every memory replaced with a scheduled activity. This was their vision for my future, a clean, manageable, beige existence. While she talked about community and peace of mind, my mind drifted. I looked at her earnest, concerned face, and all I could see was a 5-year-old girl on this very lawn, tears streaming down her face after falling off her bicycle for the 10th time. I remembered kneeling down, wiping her scraped knee, and telling her, "The only way to not fall is to not ride, and that's no way to live." Now here she was, selling me a life where no one ever fell, because no one ever truly rode. "It's a beautiful place, Dad," she finished, her voice gentle. "It's safe, and it would mean the world to us, to know you're being looked after." I just stared at the brochure in my hands. The faces of the strangers smiled back at me, their happiness manufactured and glossy. In that moment, sitting in the heart of the home I'd built, I had never felt more alone. The coordinated assault of their logic and their love had worn me down. I felt cornered, exhausted, and a deep, heavy resignation began to settle over me. Maybe they were right. Maybe this place was too much. Maybe I was just an old man, clinging to a past that was holding everyone back. I folded the brochure and pushed it back toward her. "I'll think about it, Chloe," I said, the fight draining out of me. And as she smiled, a sad, triumphant little smile, I felt the first real terror of my life, the terror of believing them. Defeat is a quiet poison. It doesn't announce itself. It just seeps into your bones until the effort of standing up straight feels monumental. After Chloe left, with her sad, victorious smile and her brochure for a beige future, I felt that poison take hold. For the first time, I started to see the cottage through their eyes. The peeling paint on the window frames wasn't charming. It was work I hadn't done. The floorboard that creaked by the fireplace wasn't a familiar old friend. It was a sign of decay. They had planted a seed of doubt, and in the fertile ground of my grief it had taken root. So, the next day, I went up to the attic. I told myself I was just sorting, just getting a head start on the inevitable packing. But it felt more like a surrender. Every object I touched was a ghost. My old army uniform, smelling of mothballs and forgotten courage, a box of Chloe's ballet trophies, their plastic gold finish now dull and cheap-looking. Ethan's collection of model airplanes, their wings thick with a decade of dust. I was cataloging a life that was already over, just waiting for the movers to come and haul away the evidence. I worked my way to the far corner, under the eaves, where Eleanor had stored her personal things. Stacks of her library books, a box of photo albums she was always meaning to organize, and her old gardening supplies, tucked behind a stack of faded quilts, was her tackle box. It was a simple, olive green metal box, dented and scratched from years of being tossed into the bottom of our fishing boat. My first instinct was to leave it. What was I going to do with it? My fishing days felt as distant as my wedding day. I reached for it, intending to move it to a pile of things destined for the dump. But when I lifted it, I paused. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. A tackle box is full of hollow plastic lures and spools of thin line. It should be light. This felt solid, grounded. A flicker of a memory surfaced, unbidden. Eleanor, sitting in the boat on a summer afternoon years ago, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. She was respooling a reel, her fingers moving with that quiet competence she brought to everything. I remembered teasing her about what she kept in that box, asking if it was full of lead sinkers. She had just smiled that secret little smile of hers and said, "Something like that, Art. Every woman needs her ballast." The memory was so vivid, so clear, that I set the box down on the dusty floor and knelt beside it. The metal latches were stiff and cold. I clicked them open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet attic. I lifted the lid, half expecting to see a jumble of rusted hooks and dried-up fishing line. But that's not what I saw. My breath caught in my throat. The top tray, where the colorful lures should have been, was gone. In its place, nestled in neat rows, were thick, tight bundles of $100 bills. My mind struggled to make sense of the image. It was like opening a dictionary and finding a pressed flower. It was wrong, and yet there it was. I lifted one of the bundles. It was real, cool, crisp paper that smelled not of fish but of a bank vault. My hands trembling, I lifted the tray out. Beneath it, the main compartment of the box was filled not with reels and pliers, but with documents in sealed plastic sleeves. There was a passport with my photograph, but a name I had never seen before. A set of keys attached to a tag with a strange address written on it, and beneath it all, a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name Arthur was written on the front in Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. I sat there on the floor of the dusty attic, the sunbeam hitting the stacks of cash, making them glow with an unreal light. The oppressive weight of the last few weeks, the feeling of being cornered and managed and erased, began to lift. It was replaced by a dizzying, electric sense of wonder. This wasn't a tackle box. This was a message, a plan. Eleanor's ballast, my ghost, my quiet, book-loving wife, had been preparing for a war I didn't even know was coming. I picked up the envelope, my thumb tracing the familiar loop of the A in my name. The poison of defeat receded, washed away by a tidal wave of love and awe. This wasn't a surrender. It wasn't an ending. It was an escape hatch, a secret map left behind by the person who knew me best. I held the letter in my hands, a tangible piece of her that felt more real than any memory. And for the first time since she left, I felt a spark of something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. She was gone, but she wasn't done fighting for me yet. I sat there for a long time, just holding the envelope. The weight of the paper felt real, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of the last few days. The attic, which moments ago had felt like a tomb for a life that was over, now felt like a command center, a war room. The ghosts of the past weren't haunting me anymore. They were arming me. My hands, which had been trembling, were now steady. With a deep breath that felt like the first one I'd taken in weeks, I broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long, filled with Eleanor's neat, concise cursive. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It was a battle plan. "My dearest Art," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and our children are behaving exactly as I feared they would. Please, my love, do not feel for 1 second that this is your fault. Their compasses were set a long time ago. I just saw the direction they were pointing in a little more clearly than you did. You always saw the best in them. I saw the bottom line. It is a terrible thing for a mother to admit, but there it is." I had to pause, my throat thick. I thought back to all the times I'd defended them to her. That Christmas, Ethan spent the entire day on his phone, checking the market value of the watch I'd given him. The time Chloe had joked that the cottage's property taxes were getting to be more than a timeshare in Maui. I'd called it ambition, a different way of seeing the world. Eleanor had just looked at me with those knowing, sad eyes and said nothing. She hadn't been judging them, she'd been taking notes. I continued reading. For the last 7 years, since Ethan's promotion and Chloe's new real estate license, I have been putting aside a small portion of my librarian's pension and our investment dividends. I called it my ballast fund. I prayed we would use it for a cruise to Alaska, but I suspected we might need it for a storm closer to home. There is $50,000 cash in this box. The rest, over $400,000, is in a bank account in Scottsdale, Arizona. The debit card and account details are in the small side pocket of this box. It is all in your name. It is clean, it is separate, and it is yours. Arizona. My chest ached with a sweet, painful memory. For years we had talked about buying a little place down there, a winter escape from the Michigan gray. We'd spread brochures on the kitchen table, dreaming of sunshine and mountains that weren't covered in snow. I thought it was just a dream. For Eleanor, it had been a contingency plan. The keys in this box are for a small, two-bedroom condo in a quiet community just outside of Scottsdale. I bought it 2 years ago. It's paid in full. It's waiting for you. My mind was reeling. A secret account, a whole other home. She had built a second life for me, a silent fortress, right under my nose. I was a carpenter. I knew how to build things with wood and nails. But Eleanor, she had built a future out of foresight and love. The letter went on, her tone shifting from loving wife to shrewd strategist. Now, for the cottage. They will threaten you. They will try to make you feel old and incompetent. They will use your grief as a weapon against you. Do not let them. The cottage is protected. I had it placed in the Eleanor Morrison Revocable Trust 5 years ago. You are the sole trustee and beneficiary. They have no legal claim, none whatsoever. They cannot sell it, they cannot mortgage it. They cannot evict you from it. They are selling air. You need a lawyer. Do not use our family lawyer. He's too soft. In this box, you will find the card for Augustus Gus's Carmichael. He was my friend in library school before he decided law was more interesting. He's sharp as a tack and has the disposition of a badger. He knows all about the trust. He has a file with your name on it. Call him. Listen to him. Let him be the bad guy. Your only job is to be the grieving husband they think you are, right up until the moment you are not. I let out a shaky laugh. A badger. That was so Eleanor. She knew I was a builder, not a fighter, so she'd hired one for me in advance. The final page of the letter was just a few short paragraphs. My love, this is not the retirement we planned, but perhaps it can still be the one you deserve. Whether you stay at the lake or go to the sun is your choice. The only thing I ask is that you choose. Don't let them choose for you. Don't let them make you small. Don't let them write your last chapter, Art. Our story was too good for such a cheap ending. Go build something new. You are still the strongest man I have ever known. All my love, forever, your Eleanor. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The oppressive fog of grief and resignation that had clouded my mind for weeks was gone, burned away by the bright, fierce light of her love. My back straightened. My hands, which had felt so old and useless, now felt capable again. I was a carpenter, and my wife had just handed me a new set of blueprints. I closed the lid of the tackle box, the click of the latches sounding like a rifle bolt sliding into place. I stood up, leaving the ghosts and the dust of the attic behind me. I walked down the narrow stairs and into the light of the main house. I went to the sliding door and looked at my reflection in the glass. The stooped, unfamiliar old man was gone. In his place was a husband with one last promise to keep. My resolve settled over me, as solid and dependable as the foundation of the house I stood in. They wanted a war. Thanks to Eleanor, I was finally ready to fight one. Walking down from the attic was like descending from a fog into the clear, sharp air of a winter morning. Everything looked the same. The familiar furniture, the pictures on the wall, the view of the lake through the window, but I was seeing it all with new eyes. The house was no longer a liability or a burden. It was a fortress, and Eleanor had just handed me the key to the armory. The sense of resolve that had settled in my chest wasn't hot like anger. It was cool and solid, like a well-set stone foundation. I knew what I had to do. But first I made a pot of coffee. The act itself was a small rebellion. I used Eleanor's favorite French press, a process that takes time and patience, a ritual my children always scoffed at. "Just get a Keurig, Dad, it's instant," Ethan had said last Christmas. But as I slowly poured the hot water over the grounds, I understood. Some things are worth the wait. Some things require a steady hand. I carried my mug to the kitchen table, the very spot where Chloe had ambushed me with her glossy brochure and her gentle poison. I sat in my usual chair, but I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like the owner of the house. I placed my hand on the smooth, worn oak of the tabletop, feeling the history in the wood. Then I took out the business card from my wallet. It was printed on thick, expensive-feeling cardstock. Augustus Gus's Carmichael, attorney at law. Underneath, in parentheses, it simply said, "Complex problems." I took a sip of the hot black coffee, letting it steady me. I looked at the phone on the counter. This call was the first real step, the first shot fired in a war I hadn't started but fully intended to finish. "Okay, Eleanor," I murmured to the empty room. "Let's go meet your badger." I dialed the number. It was answered on the second ring, not by a secretary, but by a low, gravelly voice that sounded like it ran on whiskey and disdain for foolishness. "Carmichael. Hello, my name is Arthur Morrison. My wife, Eleanor, suggested I call you." There was a pause, and for a moment I heard the sound of a heavy file being opened on a desk. "Art," the voice said, the gruffness softening by a single, barely perceptible degree. "I've been waiting for your call. I was sorry to hear about Eleanor. She was one of a kind, a damn fine librarian and an even better strategist." There was no flowery condolence, and I was grateful for it. This was a man who mourned with action, not words. "She left me a letter," I said, "and some instructions." "I know," Gus said. "She had me draft 3 different potential response packages depending on how your children decided to play their hand. From what I'm gathering, it sounds like they've chosen scenario B, full, throttle greed, and gaslighting. It's my personal favorite, very straightforward." I couldn't help but let out a short, sharp laugh. It felt good. "That sounds about right," I said. I quickly explained the phone calls from Ethan, Chloe's visit, the phantom real estate listing, and the talk of a cash offer from a developer. Gus listened without interrupting, just the occasional grunt of affirmation. When I finished, he said, "Okay, Art, here's what happens now. Your job is simple. In fact, your job is to do almost nothing at all. First, you are not to speak with them. Not Ethan, not Chloe, not any real estate agent who comes sniffing around. Every call goes to voicemail. Every text, every email, you forward to me unanswered. Your silence is now a weapon. Let them spin their wheels in it." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I," Gus said with what sounded like grim satisfaction, "am going to ruin a few people's afternoons. I have a cease and desist letter drafted for a John Doe realtor, which I will now happily address to Chloe's agency. I have a letter of advisement for both Ethan and Chloe, informing them that the property is held in an irrevocable trust and that any further action to sell or list it will be considered tortious interference with an asset. I will also be gently reminding them that a threat of a conservatorship action made under these circumstances can be viewed by a judge as attempted fraud." A profound sense of relief washed over me. The weight I'd been carrying, the need to defend myself, was lifted from my shoulders and placed into the hands of this gravel-voiced badger. "Okay, Gus," I said. "I can do that." "Good man," he said. "Eleanor knew you could. Just sit tight. Let them flail. I'll be in touch." The line clicked dead. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, the coffee mug warm in my hands. The feeling wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something better. It was agency. The feeling of a plan in motion, of wheels turning in the dark on my behalf. Just then, my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a picture of Ethan. My heart gave a familiar little jolt of anxiety, a conditioned response from a lifetime of trying to please him. But this time was different. I looked at his name, took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, and let it go to voicemail. The ringing stopped. And in the silence that followed, I smiled. The first countermove had been made, and I hadn't had to say a word. The voicemail from Ethan was exactly what I expected. It was a tidy little package of impatience and entitlement. "Dad, pick up the phone," his voice commanded, devoid of any warmth. "I'm talking to the realtor. She needs your signature on the preliminary acceptance by 5 o'clock. Don't make this difficult." He wasn't asking, he was instructing. The old me, the man from just a few days ago, would have felt a surge of anxiety, a pressure to comply. The new me simply hit delete and went back to my book. I was following my new orders. Silence. It was the easiest and most difficult thing I'd done in years. Gus Carmichael, it turned out, worked with the efficiency of a lightning strike. The storm broke the next day just after lunch. My phone began to vibrate on the kitchen counter, a frantic, insistent buzzing that wouldn't stop. First, a call from Chloe. I let it ring. A text message immediately followed. "Dad, call me now." Then another call. Then a call from Ethan. Then another from Chloe. It was a digital siege, a barrage of panicked demands. I watched the screen light up with their names, feeling a strange detachment, like a general watching the enemy's frantic maneuvers from a fortified position. Finally, a string of voicemails popped up. I listened to Chloe's first. The syrupy sweet concern from her last visit was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, panicked screech. "Dad, what is this? What did you do? My broker just called me, screaming. She got a letter from some lawyer in the city threatening to sue the agency. A cease and desist. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? I built my reputation in this town for 10 years, and you're trying to ruin it over some nostalgia." There it was. Not a word about my well-being. Not a hint of concern for me. Her first thought was for her reputation, her business. The velvet glove was off, and the hand underneath was grasping and selfish. I felt a pang, not of anger, but of a deep, weary sadness. Eleanor had been right about everything. Ethan's voicemail was next. It was short, guttural, and pulsing with rage. "You have 5 minutes to call me back, old man, or I'm driving up there myself. You have no idea the hornet's nest you just kicked." I knew this was the moment. Gus had told me to stay silent, but Eleanor's letter had told me I was still the strongest man she knew. I decided right then that strength, in this case, meant facing the storm head-on, but on my own terms. I took a deep breath, walked over to the small tape recorder Eleanor used for her library meetings, and pressed the record button. Then, I called Ethan back. He answered before the first ring finished, his voice a barely contained explosion. "Finally, what the hell do you think you're doing? You sicked a lawyer on your own family?" "Hello, Ethan," I said, my voice deliberately calm. It was amazing how steady I felt. "I took a step to protect my property. Something you and your mother always taught me was a responsible thing to do. Protect it, you've declared war. Over a rundown shack that's falling apart at the seams," he roared. "You're not thinking straight. You're emotional, you're in mourning, and you're making irrational decisions that are going to cost everyone a lot of money." "My thinking is perfectly clear," I said, my voice still even. "The cottage is not for sale." This was it. The final boundary. The one word he refused to hear. His fury went supernova. "Listen to me, and listen good," he snarled, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. "You clearly can't be trusted to manage your own affairs. If you do not call this maniac lawyer of yours off by the end of the day, I swear to God, Chloe and I will file for an emergency conservatorship. We'll stand up in front of a judge and tell him you are a danger to yourself and your finances. We will take control of everything, this house, your accounts, all of it. We will do what's necessary. Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air, ugly and final, the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't just trying to take my house, he was trying to take my life, my very identity as a competent man. And in his rage, he had handed me the very sword I needed. I let the silence stretch for a beat, letting his words echo in the quiet room. "Thank you for being so clear, Ethan," I said, my voice as cold and calm as the lake in deep winter. "I've recorded this entire conversation. I'm sure my lawyer will find it very, very useful." I hung up the phone. The silence that descended on the kitchen was absolute. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and fear. But beneath it, a new feeling was rising. The grim, unyielding satisfaction of a man who had just watched his enemy walk directly into a perfectly set trap. The lines were no longer just drawn. They were etched in stone, and my son had just handed me the chisel. After the call with Ethan, the adrenaline drained away and left a cold, hollow feeling in its place. I had the recording, the smoking gun Gus had told me would be invaluable. I packaged it up and drove it to the post office, sending it certified mail to his office in the city. The act felt momentous, like posting a declaration of war. But as I drove back along the winding road to the lake, there was no sense of triumph. There was just a profound, gut-wrenching ache. This wasn't some stranger I was fighting. This was my son. The same boy I had taught to skip stones across this very lake, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose fears of the dark I had soothed. In fighting for my own life, I felt like I was destroying a part of the one I had built. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, wandering through the cottage, the silence heavy with unspoken accusations and broken trusts. The joy I'd felt in discovering Eleanor's plan was gone, replaced by the grim reality of executing it. By evening, I couldn't stand the quiet anymore. I needed to hear a voice that wasn't laced with anger or manipulation. I needed to connect with the one part of my family that still felt pure, that still felt like us. I needed to talk to Maya. I found her number and dialed, my heart hoping for a small piece of normalcy, a reminder of the love that used to be so easy. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and full of life. "Grandpa, hi. I was just thinking about you." Just hearing her say my name, with genuine affection, was like a balm on a raw wound. "Hey kiddo," I said, forcing a warmth into my own voice that I didn't feel. "How are classes? Are you surviving the semester?" We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about a philosophy professor she loved and a boy she thought was cute but probably too dumb to date. She asked if the loons were still on the lake and if I'd been out fishing. It was so normal, so wonderfully, beautifully normal. It was a conversation from another lifetime, before lawyers and threats and battle lines. I felt my frayed nerves begin to settle. As we were about to hang up, a thought, prompted by Eleanor's meticulous planning, drifted into my mind. It wasn't a suspicion, not yet. It was just a loose thread I felt the need to gently pull. "Listen, sweetie, before you go," I started, trying to sound casual. "I just want to make sure you're really okay for money. I know college is expensive. That little bit of money I send every month, is it helping out?" Her response was immediate and effusive, and it shattered my fragile peace into a million pieces. "Oh my gosh, Grandpa, are you kidding? It's been a total lifesaver," she said, her voice full of sincere gratitude. "Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without it. Mom and Dad are so generous to give me that allowance every month. It really takes the pressure off having to get a job during the school year. They're the best." I had to sit down. My knees felt weak. Mom and Dad are so generous. They hadn't just tried to sell my house. They hadn't just threatened to strip me of my rights. They had been stealing from me, yes, but this felt infinitely worse. They had been stealing my love. They had taken my secret, heartfelt gift to my granddaughter and wrapped it up in their own colors, presenting it as their own. They were taking credit for my affection, using my money to paint themselves as benevolent, supportive parents, all while trying to render me homeless. "Grandpa, are you still there?" Maya's voice was laced with concern. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "I'm here, kiddo," I said, my voice thick. "I'm so glad it's helping. You keep working hard. You make me proud." We said our goodbyes, and I lowered the phone. I stared out the window at the lake, the setting sun painting the water in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. But I couldn't see the beauty. All I could see was the ugly, twisted shape of my children's deceit. The sadness that washed over me was immense, a cold tide that extinguished the last embers of my anger. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. This was about my legacy. And I realized with a chilling clarity that they weren't just content to take my future, they had been actively rewriting my past. I now had the final piece of the puzzle. And I knew the family meeting wouldn't just be a negotiation, it would be a reckoning. The week leading up to the meeting was the quietest of my life. I followed Gus's instructions to the letter, forwarding every frantic text and panicked voicemail without comment. The silence from my end seemed to drive them into a frenzy. They were used to pushing against a soft wall of grief and confusion. Now they were pushing against a void, and it was making them lose their balance. I spent the week preparing, not by rehearsing speeches, but by walking the property, by feeling the solid ground beneath my feet. I repaired a loose board on the dock. I rehung a shutter that had been bothering me for a year. I was reclaiming my home, not just on paper, but with my own two hands. By the time Saturday arrived, I was no longer a man adrift. I was an anchor. They arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, a united front of tailored ambition. Ethan wore a suit that was too expensive for a weekend at the lake. Chloe was dressed in a sharp blazer, her face a carefully constructed mask of somber concern. Between them walked a young, slick lawyer named Mr. Davies, who carried a slim leather briefcase and an air of supreme confidence. He looked around my kitchen with a faint, dismissive smile, as if it were a quaint but ultimately irrelevant diorama. They sat on the opposite side of the table. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. Mr. Davies started, his voice smooth and condescendingly gentle. "Thank you for meeting with us, Arthur. I'm just here to mediate. My clients, as you know, are deeply concerned for your well-being. We're all here today to find a compassionate path forward that ensures your safety and protects the financial legacy your late wife, Eleanor, worked so hard to build." I just looked at him. Gus didn't even flinch, his eyes remaining fixed on a spot on the far wall. This was their opening act, the concerned children play. I let them perform it. Davies continued, laying out their case. He spoke of my isolation, my emotional vulnerability, and the significant financial and physical burdens of maintaining the property. He painted a picture of a confused, grieving old man who needed his loving children to step in and make the hard, practical decisions. Ethan nodded along grimly. Chloe dabbed at a non-existent tear with a tissue. It was a masterful performance. I had to give them that. They had rehearsed this. When Davies finally finished his monologue, a heavy silence fell over the table. He looked at Gus, expecting a rebuttal, a negotiation. Gus slowly took off his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, and placed them back on his nose. "Mr. Davies," he began, his gravelly voice filling the room, "are you aware that this property, the Whispering Pines Cottage, is the primary asset of the Eleanor Morrison Revocable Trust, established in 2018? Davies's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "We were under the impression that the trust was a standard marital arrangement." "Then you were under the wrong impression," Gus cut in, his voice flat. "The trust's language is unequivocally clear. Mr. Arthur Morrison is the sole lifetime beneficiary and the sole acting trustee. He has absolute and total discretion over this property. Your clients," he said, finally looking at Ethan and Chloe, "have as much legal authority to sell this house as I have to sell the Mackinac Bridge. The only path forward, as you so compassionately put it, is the one Mr. Morrison decides to walk on, alone." The air went out of their side of the table. Chloe's jaw went slack. Ethan's face flushed a deep, angry red. Their lawyer, Davies, was flipping through his papers, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. This was the first blow, the legal one, and it had landed squarely. Ethan recovered first, leaning forward on his elbows. "This is ridiculous. A legal trick. That doesn't change the facts, Dad. You can't manage this place alone." And that was my cue. I opened my own folder, my hands steady. "You're right, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the table. "This isn't just about legal tricks. It's about facts. It's about trust. It's about family." I looked at Chloe, whose face was now pale. "Chloe, you spoke so movingly about my safety, my well-being. A parent's love is about sacrifice, isn't it? It's about providing for your children, making sure they have what they need." "Of course," she said, her voice a little shaky. "That's all we want." "Good," I said. "Then let's talk about Maya." A flicker of panic in her eyes. Ethan shot her a warning glance. "Maya is a wonderful girl," I continued, keeping my voice even. "And I know college is a struggle. I've been happy to help out where I can." I slid a bank statement across the table, a copy of the deposits into her account. "For the past 2 years, I have been depositing $500 into her college account on the first of every month. It was a secret gift, from me to her. That's a total of $12,000. I let that number hang in the air. Davies looked from me to his clients, his face a mask of confusion. I turned my full attention to my daughter. "The funny thing is, Chloe, when I spoke to Maya last week, she told me how grateful she was. She told me her mom and dad were so generous to give her a $500 allowance every month to help with her expenses." The silence that followed was a physical thing. It pressed down on the room, suffocating. Chloe's face crumpled. She looked like she'd been struck. Ethan stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, the rage in his eyes being replaced by sheer animal panic. Their lawyer, Davies, looked down at his notes, as if hoping to find an escape clause from this nightmare. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "I have a simple question for you, Chloe, and I want you to be honest, here in front of everyone. When you took my gift, my private expression of love for my granddaughter, and passed it off as your own, was it your intention to defraud your own daughter, or just your father?" A choked sob escaped Chloe's throat. She put her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Ethan slammed his fist on the table, the sound making the coffee mugs jump. "You have no right," he seethed. "I have every right," I said, my voice rising for the first time, cold and hard as steel. "I have the right to live in my own home. I have the right to manage my own affairs. And I have the right to not have my love for my granddaughter stolen and used as a prop to make you feel like good parents while you plot to throw me out on the street." I stood up. The meeting was over. There was nothing left to say. The foundation of their argument, the pretense of their concern, their very moral authority, had been utterly and completely demolished. They had walked into my house to declare me incompetent. And in the space of 10 minutes, I had proven that they were the ones who lacked character, who lacked honesty, and who lacked the one thing Eleanor had left me in abundance: a plan. The truth, when it finally arrives, has a sound all its own. It's not loud. It's a profound, ringing silence that sucks all the air out of the room. In that silence, you could hear the frantic, useless shuffling of Mr. Davies's papers. You could hear the hum of the old refrigerator. You could hear the complete and utter collapse of my children's world. My question just hung there in the space between us, unanswered, because it was unanswerable. Chloe couldn't lift her head. The sound of her weeping was the only reply she could offer. It wasn't a performance this time. It was the raw, ugly sound of shame. Ethan finally found his voice, but it was thin and brittle. This is a family matter. We shouldn't be." He couldn't finish the sentence. He had no ground left to stand on. It was Gus who broke the spell. He slowly placed his pen on his notepad, the small click echoing in the kitchen. He directed his words to Mr. Davies, but his eyes were fixed on Ethan. "This meeting is concluded," he said, his voice a low rumble. "However, for the record, I want to be perfectly clear on one final point." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small cassette tape, the one I had sent him, and placed it on the table. "My client has a recording of Mr. Morrison threatening an emergency conservatorship action for the explicit purpose of seizing control of his assets. Should any such petition be filed, not only will it be denied, but we will immediately file a countersuit for malicious prosecution, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and full recovery of all legal fees." He pushed the tape a few inches across the table. "This is now a legal matter. Advise your clients accordingly." Mr. Davies looked at the cassette tape as if it were a live grenade. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're leaving," he announced to the room. He walked around the table and put a hand on Chloe's shoulder. She flinched but allowed him to help her to her feet. She wouldn't look at me. Her face was blotchy and swollen, her eyes fixed on the floor as if the cracked linoleum held the answers to how her life had just imploded. Ethan stood as well, his fists clenched at his sides. He shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred. It was the look of a man who had been thoroughly outplayed and would never, ever forgive it. He didn't say a word. He just turned and stormed out of the cottage, slamming the screen door behind him with a crack that made me jump. Davies guided Chloe out more gently, a slow, humiliating walk of shame. The pristine white SUV started up, spun gravel in the driveway, and was gone. And then it was quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. Gus began packing his briefcase with the unhurried movements of a man who has done his job. I just sat there, staring at the empty chairs across from me. There was no elation, no surge of victory. I just felt empty. I had won. I had saved my home. I had defended my wife's memory. But I had taken a sledgehammer to the foundations of my own family. There's no celebration in that. "You did good, Art," Gus said softly, snapping his briefcase shut. "Eleanor would be proud." "Would she?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "She would have hated this." "She would have hated the alternative more," he said, and with a firm pat on my shoulder, he was gone too. I was alone. I sat at the table for a long time, the silence pressing in. The war was over, but the battlefield was my kitchen, and the casualties were my own children. That evening, Chloe called. Her voice was wrecked, thick with tears. "Daddy?" she whispered, the word sounding like it was being ripped out of her. I'm so sorry. I never meant for." She couldn't form a coherent sentence. It was just a stream of broken excuses and self-pity. She'd been trying to keep up with the neighbors. Ethan had put so much pressure on her, she never thought I'd find out. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a confession born of being caught. I listened, my heart aching with a grief that felt older and deeper than the one I felt for Eleanor. I didn't offer her forgiveness. I didn't offer her anything. When she finally ran out of words, I just said, "Goodbye, Chloe," and ended the call. An hour later, a text message lit up my phone. It was from Ethan. There were no tears, no excuses. Just a single bitter line. "You got what you wanted. Hope you're happy alone in that stupid house." I read the message and felt a strange sense of clarity. The division was complete. Chloe was drowning in a sea of her own regret, while Ethan was standing on the shore, angrily blaming the tide. They had faced the same truth, and it had split them apart. I turned off my phone and looked out the window into the deep, starless night over Heron Lake. I wasn't happy, but for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood, and I was standing on my own ground. The days following the meeting were like the strange, calm stillness after a violent thunderstorm. The lightning had struck, the thunder had rolled, and now all that was left was the heavy, saturated air and the knowledge that the landscape had been irrevocably changed. Chloe's tearful, broken call was followed by silence. Ethan's bitter text was followed by more silence. It was a silence I didn't try to fill. I had spent a lifetime filling their silences, smoothing over their mistakes, absorbing their endless needs. I was done, but Eleanor, it turned out, was not. I had thought the main purpose of the tackle box was the escape plan, the money, the condo, the legal shield of the trust. I was wrong. That was just the defense. Deep in the bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was the offense. It was a simple, hardbound ledger, the kind librarians use. On the first page, in Eleanor's perfect script, was the title, The Bank of Mom and Dad, A History of Unsecured Loans. I spent a whole morning reading it. Page after page, she had meticulously documented every financial rescue mission we had ever mounted for our children, going back 15 years. It was all there, in black and white. The down payment for Ethan's first condo, the capital to help Chloe start her real estate agency, the thousands to cover Ethan's unforeseen trading losses, the money to pay for Chloe's lavish wedding, which she'd insisted her own business could cover. But what struck me were Eleanor's small, penciled-in notes in the margins. Next to a $15,000 entry for Ethan, she had written, he said it was for a market downturn. Saw him post pictures on a new jet ski a week later. Beside a $10,000 loan to Chloe for closing costs on her own house, the note read, she was carrying a new designer handbag the next time I saw her, the one from the magazine. Reading that ledger was like seeing my whole life in a new, brutally clear light. We hadn't been helping them, we had been enabling them. We had built their lives on a foundation of our own making, and they had grown to see our support not as a gift, but as an entitlement. They weren't just trying to sell the cottage, they were just trying to liquidate the main branch of the bank that had funded their entire adult lives. I closed the ledger and felt a profound, chilling clarity. Eleanor hadn't just left me a shield. She had left me a pair of shears to finally cut the strings. The first call I made was to the vice president of a regional bank. Tucked in with the ledger was a co-signed line of credit for Ethan's boutique financial advisory firm, a $50,000 safety net I'd co-signed for years ago at his pleading to give his business the appearance of solvency. Eleanor, bless her shrewd mind, had insisted on a single clause in the fine print, a demand clause. It meant that as the co-signer, I had the right to have the loan called due at any time, for any reason. I had forgotten all about it. She hadn't. Mr. Morrison, the banker said, his voice smooth. To what do I owe the pleasure? I'm calling about the line of credit for the Morrison Financial Group, I said calmly. I'd like to exercise the demand clause. Please inform my son that the full balance is due and payable in 30 days, and that I am removing myself as guarantor, effective immediately. There was a stunned silence on the other end. I see, the banker finally managed. I'm sure we can. There's nothing to discuss, I said, my voice polite but firm as granite. Please proceed as instructed. I hung up, imagining the frantic, panicked call Ethan would soon receive. His image, his carefully crafted illusion of success, was built on that line of credit. I had just pulled the foundational stone out from under his temple of arrogance. There was no pleasure in it, not really. It just felt necessary. It felt like justice. The second call was more difficult. It was to an old friend of ours, a man named George, who owned the other half of a small commercial building downtown. With George, Eleanor and I had invested in the property years ago, and, as I learned from a document in the tackle box, we had been leasing the prime storefront space to Chloe's real estate agency for nearly a third of the going market rate. This subsidy, this hidden gift, was the only reason her business was profitable. It was what funded the white SUV and the designer clothes. Tucked into the partnership agreement was a simple right of first refusal. If I wanted to sell my share, George had the first option to buy. Art, my friend, how are you holding up? George's voice was warm and kind. We spoke for a few minutes, and then I got to the point. George, I said, I'm restructuring my assets. I'd like to offer you my half of the downtown building. I have a fair market appraisal right here. I'm ready to sell today. He was quiet for a moment. Are you sure, Art? I know what that lease meant to Eleanor and to Chloe. Eleanor's wishes were for me to be secure, I said, the words feeling true and solid in my mouth. And Chloe is a very successful businesswoman. I'm sure she'll have no trouble paying the market rate. We sealed the deal in less than 10 minutes. In a month, George would be the sole owner, and Chloe's rent would triple. She would either have to become a truly successful agent, or she would have to face the reality that her success had been a long-term loan from the parents she had tried to discard. After I hung up the phone, I carefully placed the ledger and the documents back into the tackle box and closed the lid. It was done. The quiet dismantling was complete. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't threatened, I had simply closed the bank. I walked out onto the porch and looked out at Heron Lake. The sun was high, the water was calm, and for the first time I felt the full weight of my own freedom. I had not only saved my home, I had reclaimed my life from the long shadows of their expectations and needs. They were on their own now, and I, finally, was on mine. After the last of the calls were made, and the final pieces of Eleanor's plan were in motion, a new kind of quiet settled over the cottage. It was no longer the heavy silence of grief or the tense silence of war. It was the clean, clear silence of a slate wiped clean. I spent the next 2 weeks not packing, but preparing. I fixed the screen door that always stuck. I restained the porch swing. I winterized the pipes. I was tending to the house, getting it ready for a long, quiet sleep. It felt like an act of love, a final conversation with the home we had built. I wasn't abandoning it, I was honoring it. The day I left, I packed a single suitcase. Clothes, a few books, the framed photo of Eleanor from our trip to the Grand Canyon. I also packed the olive green tackle box. It felt wrong to leave it behind. On the kitchen table, I left a laminated card with my new post office box in Arizona and a key for my neighbor, with a note asking him to check on the place once a month. I took one last look around, at the way the light fell across the floorboards, at the faint pencil marks on the doorframe. Then I closed the door, locked it, and didn't look back. The flight from Detroit to Phoenix was like traveling between worlds. I watched the lush green tapestry of Michigan, with its thousands of glittering blue lakes, slowly give way to the neat ordered squares of the heartland, and then finally to the vast, rugged, sun-baked landscapes of the Southwest. It felt like I was flying out of the complicated, watery depths of the past and into the clear, dry certainty of the future. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was flying toward something. Stepping out of the Phoenix airport was like walking into a warm, open hand. The air was different, dry, clean, and smelling of dust and distant blossoms. The sky was a shade of blue, so vast and profound it felt like you could fall upward into it forever. It was the sky Eleanor and I had always dreamed of. I took a cab to the address on the keychain from the tackle box. The community was quiet, a collection of simple, terracotta-roofed condos nestled against a backdrop of the McDowell Mountains. It was unassuming and peaceful. I found number 24, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The condo was cool and filled with a soft, indirect light. It was simple, clean, and perfect. 2 bedrooms, a small, modern kitchen, and a living room with a glass door that led out to a small private patio. But what made my breath catch was the furniture. It was already there. A comfortable-looking leather armchair was angled toward the window, perfect for reading. A sturdy wooden table stood in the dining nook, and on the bookshelf against the wall, I saw the familiar spines of some of my favorite authors. Eleanor had done this. She must have hired a designer, picked everything out online, and had it all delivered and arranged. She had built my nest for me before she left. It was the last, most painful, and most beautiful gift she could have possibly given me. That first evening, I didn't do much. I ordered a pizza, sat on my new armchair, and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The colors were unlike anything in Michigan. Fiery oranges, deep purples, and dusky pinks painting the sky. The silence here wasn't the lonely silence of the cottage. It was a peaceful, contented silence. The silence of a place where nothing was demanded of me. The next morning, I established a new routine. I woke with the sun, made coffee, and drank it on the patio as the desert slowly came to life. I found a local diner that made biscuits and gravy that were almost as good as Eleanor's. I unpacked my suitcase and arranged my books on the shelves she'd prepared. I took the contents out of the tackle box, the documents, the ledger, the passport, and placed them in a small, fireproof safe I bought at the hardware store. I wiped the old tackle box clean and set it on a shelf in the spare room, which I had already decided would be my workshop. Its job as an armory was over. Now it was a monument. In the weeks that followed, I felt a lifetime of tension release from my shoulders. I was no longer a husband, a father, a problem to be solved, or a caretaker of a legacy. I was just art. A man in a new town, with a quiet life and a sky that never seemed to end. I started taking walks in the mornings, before the heat set in. I learned the names of the cacti and the birds. I found I didn't think about Ethan or Chloe very much. They felt like characters in a book I had finished reading a long time ago. Here, in the clean, dry air of the desert, a new dawn had finally broken. And for the first time in a very long time, I was free. The first few months in Arizona passed in a peaceful, sun-drenched blur. I learned the rhythms of the desert, the cool tranquility of the mornings, the sleepy stillness of the midday heat, and the spectacular theater of the sunsets. I found a local woodworking club, a group of old-timers like me who preferred the language of sawdust and varnish to idle chatter. I was building things again, simple birdhouses, a new bookshelf for the spare room. My hands were busy, and my mind was quiet. The ghosts of Heron Lake felt a million miles away. One afternoon, as I watched a hummingbird dart among the bougainvillea, I realized that my peace felt incomplete. It was a beautiful, solitary peace, but peace, like happiness, is always better when it's shared. I went inside and called Maya. Her college spring break was coming up. "I have a proposition for you," I said when she answered. "Forget the beach. I've got a spare room with your name on it, a swimming pool that's always the perfect temperature, and a sun that refuses to quit. What do you say?" Her joyful yes was all the confirmation I needed. A week later, I was waiting for her at the airport. When she walked through the sliding doors and saw me, her face broke into a huge grin. She ran the last few feet and threw her arms around me. "Grandpa," she said, squeezing me tight, "you look different." She pulled back and studied my face. "You look happy." And the amazing thing was, I was. Driving her back to the condo, I saw my new life through her eyes. The stark beauty of the mountains, the towering saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels, the impossibly blue sky. To her, it was an adventure, a new world. And seeing her excitement, I felt like I was discovering it all over again myself. That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of deep orange and lavender, we sat on the patio. I decided it was time. I went inside and came back with a thick file folder. "Your grandmother and we made some mistakes with your mom and your uncle," I began, my voice quiet. "We thought giving them money was the same as giving them support, but a safety net, if you leave it there too long, starts to look like a hammock. It encourages people to lie down." I told her the whole story then, about the tackle box, about the secret fund, about her parents' plans, and the final, ugly meeting in the kitchen. I didn't do it to poison her against them, but to arm her with the truth. She listened quietly, her eyes sad but understanding. She told me things were tense at home. Her mom was trying, attending therapy, but her dad was angry and bitter, blaming everyone but himself. "They're on their own path now, Maya," I said gently, "but your grandmother wanted to make sure you had a different one." I pushed the folder across the table. "Eleanor was a librarian. She believed in being prepared. For years, she quietly built a portfolio for you, an educational and life fund. It's not a lottery ticket, it's a foundation. It's meant for building things: a semester abroad, a down payment on a small apartment, a business you believe in. It's not for fixing other people's mistakes." She opened the folder, her eyes widening as she saw the statements. But it wasn't the number that made her tear up. It was the name on the account, the Maya Shaw Compass Fund. "A compass?" she whispered. "Your grandma said she wanted you to have something that would always help you find your own true north," I explained, "no matter how lost other people got." She looked up at me, tears glistening in her eyes. She thought of everything. "She always did," I said, my own voice thick. We sat there as the last of the light faded, and the first stars appeared in the vast desert sky. The air grew cool. This moment, I realized, was the true inheritance. It wasn't the money, the house, or the trust. It was this: sitting with my granddaughter, passing on not just a portfolio, but a legacy of wisdom earned through pain. It was the feeling of a connection reforged, a bridge built from the wreckage of the past straight into the heart of the future. I had lost a son and a daughter, at least for now. But looking at Maya, her face illuminated by the soft patio light, I knew with a deep, peaceful certainty that Eleanor's and my story hadn't ended. We had just found the right person to help us write the next chapter. Life settles into a new rhythm when you stop fighting. After Maya's visit, the last vestiges of the storm in my heart finally passed. The days took on a simple, comforting shape, marked by the rising sun and the pleasure of working with my hands. The condo, once Eleanor's secret plan, had become my sanctuary. It was a life built not on the shifting sands of other people's expectations, but on the solid rock of my own peace. But the past never vanishes completely. It just becomes an echo. One afternoon, a letter arrived, forwarded from my P.O. box. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and the handwriting was Chloe's. It wasn't a card, it was a real, multi-page letter. I sat on the patio and read it, my coffee growing cold beside me. It was rambling and messy, full of justifications that still sounded like excuses. But underneath it all was a current of genuine, painful remorse. She wrote about her therapy, about the shame of what she'd done, about how she was trying to understand the person she'd become. The last line read, "I know I broke your trust, Daddy. Maybe it can't be fixed, but I am practicing how to be a person who deserves it." I folded the letter. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a reunion, but it was a beginning, a practice. A few weeks later, a text from Ethan. It wasn't a bitter screed or a demand. It was just a photograph, blurry and poorly lit. It was a picture of a kitchen cabinet door, hanging perfectly straight on its hinges. Below it, he had typed a single, awkward sentence. "Figured out how to fix the hinge you were always tightening." I stared at the photo for a long time. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in a decade. It was his own clumsy, wordless letter. A small acknowledgement that there was value in the things I knew how to do, the things that couldn't be bought or sold. I didn't write back. Not yet. But I saved the photo. That afternoon, I made my last call to Gus. I told him I wanted to make one final change to the trust. The Whispering Pines cottage, the land, everything I wanted it preserved for Maya and for her children, should she have them. It could never be sold to a developer. It could never be leveraged. It was to remain a home, a sanctuary, a place for scraped knees and fishing lessons and quiet sunrises. "We'll call it the Eleanor Morrison Legacy Trust," Gus said, his voice holding a rare note of warmth. She would have liked that. With the final papers signed and the future of the cottage secure, I felt the last knot in my chest finally loosen. My work was done. Eleanor's plan was complete. That evening, I sat on my patio as the desert sky put on its nightly spectacle. I had the old framed photo of Eleanor on the small table beside me, the one from the Grand Canyon all those years ago. She was squinting in the sun, her smile wide and genuine. I looked at her and then out at the mountains, and I finally understood the last part of her lesson. My children had thought a home was an asset, a collection of walls and land with a number attached. They thought my life was a problem to be managed. But Eleanor knew the truth. A home isn't the wood and nails. It's the love and the labor you pour into it. A life isn't something you liquidate, it's something you build. And true wealth isn't the money you accumulate, it's the promises you keep, especially to yourself. I had lost a version of my family, that's true. But I had found myself, I had honored my wife, and I had built a bridge for my granddaughter to walk across into her own future. The echoes from the pines on Heron Lake were faint now, distant memories of a storm that had passed. Here, in the quiet of the desert, under a blanket of stars, I was finally, simply, home.